In the spiritual literature, there's one phenomenon that is rather fascinating, that holds a special place, and that is levitation. And this is something, of course, is legendary with various yogis, but also even in the West. St. Francis is said to have levitated, and his brothers would see him in the middle of the night kind of floating in the treetops. St. Teresa of Avila herself describes her levitation. She levitated. In fact, she would have to sit in the chapel with her sisters, and she might start to rise up in the chapel, and the sisters sitting on either side would have to hold her down. This isn't just hearsay. She was instructed by her spiritual director to write about her spiritual experiences, and she describes it all in great detail. The collected works of St. Teresa of Avila, you can get those and read all about it. St. John of the Cross, the same thing. And of course, the yogis of India and Tibet. So there is this interesting phenomenon of levitation, and it seems to be correlated with a very high level of spiritual attainment. What is this all about? Why is levitation correlated with high spiritual development? Whether it happens spontaneously, as seemingly in the case of these Western saints that I mentioned and others, or intentionally, as in the case of India's and Tibet's yogis. When you think about it, it's a kind of miraculous thing. Think of what must be going on to lift this heavy body up into the air. What is doing that? What force, what power is doing that? You could say grace. You can, if you have no better explanation, that's probably good enough. But the truth is that what is actually the engine behind this miraculous feat is prana. Now, Patanjali talks about, in his Yoga Sutras, in the 3rd chapter, he talks about samyama, which is a process of essentially a kind of meditation process that combines dharana, fixity of attention, dhyana, meditation, which is a flow of attention, and samadhi, which is absorption or pure consciousness. It combines all three of those into one process called samyama. And he describes in the 3rd chapter how you can, by doing samyama on different things, different objects, you gain certain siddhis or supernormal yogic abilities, one of which is levitation. And so in there he talks about, by samyama, on the relationship between the body and akasha or space, and lightness of, for instance, a cotton fiber, just lightness of something, that you can gain the ability to levitate. That's the result of samyama on that. Relationship between body and akasha, and the lightness, for instance, of a cotton fiber. But even so, what that samyama does is it activates prana to do the work of the levitation. So now, let's dig into it even a little deeper and see what prana we're talking about. What is going on here? It's very interesting. And why do yogis even try to do this? So there are 5 different prana vayus. There's prana in the sort of general sense. Prana is life breath. It's that vital force that the pranamaya kosha, that layer of our being that is the energetic body, is made of. So these 5 different vayus. So let's go through them. There's prana vayu. That's the forward moving air. So it gives an impulse moving forward. And these vayus each have many functions. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Apana vayu. That is the downward moving air. So eliminates from the body. Then udana vayu. That is the upward moving air. Samana vayu is a kind of balancing vayu that moves, draws within, draws within towards the center. And finally, Vyana Vayu, which spreads out throughout the whole body. So these 5 Vayus. Now, 2 or 3 of these are especially important in levitation, that actually perform that feat of levitation, this miraculous lifting up of the body. Obviously, the first one is Udana Vayu, that upward moving air. The force of that upward moving air is what lifts the body up. And secondly, Vyana Vayu is very important because it spreads out that lightness, that sense of spaciousness, akasha, throughout the body. So Vyana spreads out, akasha, the lightness, and Udana lifts the body up. And if you don't simply want to float up and hover, if you want to move forward and travel, then Prana Vayu, the forward moving air, comes into play and plays the role of moving you forward so you can travel where you want to. So these 3 pranas are especially involved in levitation. Now, why would anybody do this? Why do yogis want to do this? The same reason that Patanjali spends a whole chapter. He only has 4 chapters in the Yoga Sutra, but he spends a full chapter on samyama. And he says samyama, these 3, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, they're more intimate practices to the science of yoga than everything that he had spoken of previous to that 3rd chapter. So it's like the different limbs of yoga. So it's a very intimate, more esoteric aspect of yoga. And the reason that it's important is because prana plays a huge role in the evolution of a person, the spiritual growth of a person. In fact, prana plays a huge role in the formation of a person from the time they are first conceived, because all movement is based on prana. And so when the conception happens, there's prana involved. As the fetus starts to form and grow, and how it grows, all the prana vayus are involved in that process. Udana vayu is involved in forming the upper body and so forth. Apana vayu starts to form the lower body. All these pranas are subtly guiding the whole growth of the fetus to become a fully formed human being. Now, after birth, when you start to meditate, and especially if you're doing samyama, it activates these pranas to continue to form the human being, to continue to grow the structures, the subtle aspects of the structures of the panchakosha, to embody higher consciousness. And so people who are advanced meditators, and if you're doing samyama, you're an advanced meditator, you'll notice that you may feel at times different sensations in the body, pressures in the head and the heart and so forth. You may even experience movements. This is the prana being activated to continue to grow the panchakosha to support higher consciousness. It, of course, is purifying the panchakosha. And just briefly, the panchakosha that I'm referring to are the layers of your being. So there's annamaya kosha, the sheath of food, this physical body. Pranamaya kosha, the energetic body, which is made of the pranavayus. It's the vital body. Then there's the manomaya kosha, which is the mental, emotional sheath of your being, the mental, emotional body, you could say. And then vijnanamaya kosha, the discernment kosha, the discernment sheath, which is the sheath of the intellect, the sheath of intuition. And then there's anandamaya kosha, which is very fine layer of your relative being that inherits the bliss of which is the very nature of your higher self. So that Anandamaya kosha is the sheath of bliss. And of course, all these sheaths house and also shroud, like a sheath shrouds, the innermost self, pure consciousness. Okay, so as you continue to meditate and the prana awakens and becomes subtler and finer and more penetrating and more powerful, it can seep into the nooks and crannies of the panchakosha and continue their development, purify them to become transparent to that eternal bliss consciousness that is your inmost self. That is how you realize the self, by the panchakosha becoming transparent. But that is also how the growth towards self-realization is accelerated by samyama. This is why samyama is a very precious, esoteric, intimate yogic science, because it accelerates this formation of the panchakosha to support higher consciousness, the continued evolution of the panchakoshas. So that is the purpose. And of course, all the different cities, all of the different samyama and the various objects that Patanjali talks about in the 3rd chapter, all of those has this effect of moving prana to develop the panchakoshas further and purify them. But of all the different cities, levitation, this miraculous lifting of the body, is perhaps the most powerful, the most holistic. The whole body has to lift up into the air. So it's very powerful, very holistic, has a huge effect of purifying and developing the panchakoshas. So it is why yogis do this, why they even bother to levitate. It's not for the sake of the body lifting up a few feet in the air. That's nothing. They don't care about that. But what they care about is this huge evolutionary effect of awakening and directing these pranas to develop the panchakoshas to support self-realization, realization of Brahman.